Hi, everyone. What an incredible opportunity to be here tonight and to take part in one of these talks. I work for the Mabula Groundhornbill project. I also lead the South African Groundhornbill Working Group, which is a group of collaborators in South Africa working for the species. And then I'm the chair for the IUCN Hornbill Specialist Group for Africa. So trying to see what we can do for a number of other African hornbill species as well. What I'm presenting tonight, and anything any of us ever do for ground hornbills, is part of a massive collaboration. Ground hornbills are just too tricky, too long-lived, too difficult really for any one agency or any one small group of people to do anything about. And it's going to take all of us in South Africa if we're going to try and turn this around. So we work with other NGOs, with a lot of our national setups like sand parks, the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, SANBI, parks across our borders, all of our local provincial nature conservation departments, all of the ex situ community that help with the hand rearing of chicks and the holding of captive breeding pairs and helping us with education, a number of private reserves. And then the more we learn about ground hornbills, the more we realize there's so much that we still don't know about ground hornbills. And so there's a huge contingent of academics working on the species as well, as we try and unlock what it is about them we can use as a conservation tool. So just so you know, going forward, what I'm presenting is behalf on all of us and also a massive citizen science contingent that I'll get into in a little bit. So for those of you who haven't met these gorgeous beasts, the red-faced one is our southern ground hornbill, Bucorvis leadbeaterei, which occurs from southern Kenya all the way through down to the Eastern Cape. And you can see from the map that the South African part of the range is quite an odd shape. And we really are on the marginal end of the species range. Whereas the species with the blue throat pouch predominantly is the northern or Abyssinian ground hornbill, which occurs north of the equator. And this is an incredibly understudied big bird. And so what we're hoping is everything that we're learning for the southern ground hornbills now, once we understand a little bit more about the northerns, we'll be able to hopefully apply some of the same conservation tools so that we can jumpstart things for that species as well. But unfortunately, in South Africa, the southern ground hornbill is listed as endangered, as it is in Namibia. And now we're working with a number of our range states to try and understand what the conservation status is in some of the other range states. But certainly in the southern part of the range, the species is endangered and unfortunately still sliding to critically endangered. So at the moment, everything we're doing is simply to try and put the brakes on that decline. And once we can do that, we can start turning things around and try and rebuild the population. So this is a map of what we're sitting with in South Africa. The blue blocks that you can see there are all of our historic records. So you can see quite widespread across the eastern part of the country. But then when you look at the tiny red blocks at a pentad scale, you can see what we've got left. So down in the Eastern Cape, let me just, sorry, my screen, let me just see if I can get in there. Whoops, sorry. So yes, okay, so you can see you know, down in the Eastern Cape, an incredibly fragmented population. As we move up through KZN, you can see there's quite a strong core population in the rural communal grazing areas of southern KZN. Then sort of north of Shishleyo-Mfolozi, you're starting to see a massive gap with just one breeding group left in Swaziland. So basically, we're seeing this monstrous gap between essentially HIP and the southern Kruger boundaries. Then you can basically see the outline of Kruger National Park in ground hornbill sightings. And that for us makes it very clear that the problem is people. You know, people are generally excluded from our national parks other than for tourism. And so, you know, it points us very clearly to the fact that many, or just about all of the threats that the species faces are anthropogenic in nature. And then when you look up at the top along the Limpopo River Valley, where it borders with Zimbabwe and Botswana, we're starting to see a recolonization. And this is really cool because this is a natural recolonization. All we've put into this area is a lot of education. And we're starting to see a population that was essentially completely wiped out in the 80s, starting to recolonize. Groups are starting to split into smaller groups, and they're starting to take ownership of that historic range again. So this is the picture and what we're dealing with at the moment. For the longest time, certainly when my parents were doing their research in Kruger National Park from 1969 onwards, the focus was very much on our savannas, our protected areas. And actually, though, as we started to turn our gaze away from protected areas and to try and understand what was happening beyond those borders, this is essentially what a typical ground-hornbill habitat looks like. Ground-hornbills are an incredibly integral part of the rural African landscape, moving in between homes, homesteads, cattle, and just a very much an everyday and accepted part of rural life. And through this, we've started to understand how incredibly valuable the cultural protection of the species is, and to figure out how we can harness that for the conservation of the species, but also to understand more about what its habitat preferences are and why in some parts of southern KZN, ground hornbills are at higher density than they are even in our Kruger National Park. So as I said, unfortunately, the problem is overwhelmingly us. And what I'd like to share with you now is a little animation that we've made for sharing in all of the rural schools that we work with. We're hoping kids will be sharing these. This is just an English version with our animator's voice, but John Carney, Dr. John Carney has committed to doing the English and the also voiceovers, and Dr. Mhlope has also agreed to do the Zulu. So we've got some incredible big names who are going to be lending their voices to this animation, and I can't wait to share the final product. But here's a little sneak peek at the little animation that we've done, which is a story of a little girl called Knowledge. And essentially she and a ground hornbill in her dreams walk through the landscape together and understand a lot of what those threats are, and what they can try collectively do about it.
In a small village, there lived a clever girl called Knowledge. One night, as her grandfather said goodnight, she asked him why the rains had not come. The grandfather said that many years ago, there were these giant birds called the Groundhornbill, also known as thunder or rainbirds, that had a magnificent call that would often be followed by good rain. But he hadn't seen one in many years. Maybe that was why there was no rain. The young girl fell into a deep sleep and was startled by a loud sound. It was the Groundhornbill. The giant bird greeted her by name and asked if she could help him. He would return to the village and call for the rains. As the two of them walked, the giant thunderbird said that most of the trees that they had nested in had been cut down, forcing them to leave. He said that they only needed one tree per family, and the little girl said she would ask her villagers to protect those specific trees. "Thank you," said the bird. The few that had stayed only had strange-looking trees to roost on. The giant bird pointed to an electricity post. But these trees had often hurt or electrocuted them, forcing their families to leave too. As they continued, Knowledge jumped with fright as she saw a large puff adder on the track. But the giant bird marched past her, and with one stab of its head, killed it and ate it. She was so grateful that snakes terrified her and her family. The giant bird then pointed at a dead rat lying in the field, and was about to eat it when the little girl said no. It was probably poisoned, and it would kill him if he ate it, she said. Some farmers still use poison to keep the predators or rats away from their livestock or food. The little girl said she would discuss alternatives with the village, like good kraals, herd dogs, or cats to keep away the predators and rats. "Thank you," said the bird as he hopped excitedly along. The bird then walked past a window and immediately began to attack it. The little girl quickly covered the window with a blanket, and he instantly stopped. "Why did you do that?" she asked. The bird said he had seen another ground hornbill in the window and needed to defend his territory, nest, and wife. While chuckling to herself, she covered some of the other lower windows so he wouldn't break them. As they passed a particular house, the giant bird pointed at the house and said that some of the men from that house had tried to catch and kill him. believing that if they did, they would steal his great voice and make themselves more powerful. The little girl thought for a moment and said that the voice of one man is not as important as the voice that brings the rain. I will tell my people of all the dangers you face. I think we can make our village safe for you to return, and hopefully, if you are happy and safe, also call the rain, and perhaps kill a couple of snakes as well. The bird began to flap excitedly and call loudly. The sound of thunder echoed through the air. And I think they will listen, she said. After all, her name was Knowledge.
So that's just as an introduction to a number of the threats that we need to tackle. By far, the largest one in South Africa that we're facing at the moment is secondary or accidental poisoning. There's still a lot of farmers in our landscapes that are still using poison bait to try and get rid of so-called pest species. And groundhornbills are smart and they are opportunistic, and they will absolutely scavenge if they find a nice little yummy morsel somewhere left out in the bush. And so this is one of the big ones that we're trying to tackle. The other one that we've only really learned through the reintroduction program is the threat of lead toxicosis. You know, this is something that's been very well known for species like vultures, but only recently have we discovered what a massive, massive threat this is to groundhornbills. And so when hunters or anyone shooting really, even for culling purposes, any lead ammunition that's left in the veld in offal or in an animal that's injured and gets away, it takes essentially about a third of a grain of rice to kill a groundhornbill. So it really doesn't take a lot of lead. And unfortunately, because groundhornbills move through the landscape together, if they find something like that, they will all consume it. And so with this and other poisons, it's not just that we're losing individuals, but they're actually wiping out entire breeding units. So those are some of the big ones that we have to tackle: the electrocution, persecution for breaking window, a little bit of trade, and then also just the loss of nests. We're losing a lot of our really big trees in the landscape, whether it's to elephant impact or, you know, increased flooding, as we see changes in climate, fires, and groundhornbills need about a 40 to 50 centimeter hollow to nest in. And so without these big trees in their landscape, we're finding groups that are left without not a single nest within their 100 square kilometer territory that's suitable for them to nest in. And because they're so long lived, they will just plod on and hope that maybe a nest will come up in the next 5-10 years. And so trying to support that is something that we have to do with some urgency. I'm not getting my slides to advance. There we are. So there's a big number of human threats that they face. And obviously, you know, these threats are increasing rather than decreasing, unfortunately. And then when you couple that with the species life history strategies, we really see that they're simply not able to breed fast enough in the face of all of these unnatural offtakes. They're really long-lived. We estimate up to 70 years in captivity. They're big. They fledge a maximum of one chick per group. So even if you see a group of 9-10 birds, there's still only one breeding female, and the most that group can ever produce is one chick a year. And they simply don't breed every year. So if the rains aren't great or they're quite busy with their current chick, they're quite happy to skip 2, 3, 4 years before they try a breeding attempt again. They reach maturity very late, so on average 8 to 10 years in captivity, but that's just until they're biologically ready to breed. In the social structures, they have to become one of the alpha pair, the alpha male or the alpha female, before they're able to breed. So, you know, we've got birds still helpers in their natal groups at the age of 22, 25 years old. So although they're biologically ready to breed, until they get a gap to be the boss, they don't get a chance. And as I mentioned before, they have these enormous spatial requirements. So on average in the South African context, these territories are anything from 80 to 100 square kilometers, or even up in the Limpopo River Valley. In that recolonizing population, we're looking at 200 square kilometers per family group. And often these territories span any number of land uses. It can be timber, sugarcane, game farming, commercial farming, cropping, villages. So there's a lot going on within each territory, and with that, a lot of associated threats. They also then have a very high parental investment. So the youngsters are really quite stupid. Let me rephrase that. The male youngsters are particularly stupid. The young females get kicked out of the group most often before they're even a year of age, and they have to learn to go it alone. Whereas the young males need to hang in with the group and learn everything that they need to learn, all of the bush skills that they need to survive, how to kill highly venomous snakes, how to evade predation from caracals, from leopards, from cheetah. So there's a lot of teaching that goes on within these groups. And, if we're losing the experienced mentors from groups, those youngsters aren't getting the right kind of developmental inputs that they need to survive themselves through to adulthood. The cool thing is, though, if we can get them to 5 years old and there are none of the people threats, then there's a very good chance they'll live until they're 60 or 70 years old. So, once they've acquired those skills, then technically they're good to go for a while. So essentially what these ground hornbills need is a lot of time and a lot of space. So this would be what an average group looks like. There's the female with the blue coloration on her throat on the top and her mate. And all of the other birds in the group are predominantly young males who are there just to defend the territory and help provide food for her and her chick when it hatches. So, the bigger the army, the better they are. But on average, groups are anything from 4 to 5. If they're more than 3, they breed better. But we're starting to see a few little things creeping in. So obviously there's a skewed mortality. The young females are obviously much more vulnerable to predation when they're on their own. So there are very many more males in the population than there are females. And we're starting to see, the more we look, the more we find males with female coloration. So we've had a student at Honest Wood working on this. We do know it's not any of the male hormones, and so we're fundraising at the moment to be able to run another series of assays because we don't really understand what it's about. Either we've just been sexing them incorrectly forever, or there's something else, some sort of endocrine disruption going on. So we're trying to understand what that's all about at the moment. And then, as I said, those alphas, particularly the alpha male, is super important in teaching those youngsters how to do what they need to do. So here's some of the satellite tracking data from the Fitzpatrick Institute's project and the APNR. So I've just sort of circled 2 different groups worth of localities. And those territories are pretty permanent on the landscape. Those borders are pretty definite. There may be a little bit of overlap in the winter seasons, but they very much maintain and defend these territorial boundaries. In the pink block, that is for the females. So 92% of the young girls disperse when they're on 11 months of age, and they move 4 or more territories away from home. So they're the wandering ones out in the landscape, whereas the boys leave the group anything from 3 years to 20 years, but 45 months on average, and they essentially just move next door. So the boys go close and the girls go far. And the key thing with these territories is they need to provide everything that the species needs, the good and the bad, for decades. So if there's massive fires, if there's drought, that territory needs to be able to sustain the group through whatever it is that they need. So they're an incredibly difficult species to census because they are so low density naturally. You can easily visit a 100 square kilometer territory a number of times in a row and never encounter the group that's in there unless you're up early in the morning to hear them calling. So certainly the birding fraternity has been an enormous help with birdlasser, with the atlasing project. So if you are using birdlasser, please click on us and allow us to be a cause, because under the new Poppy Act, we're not allowed to access that data unless you officially sign on in the app that you give us permission for that. So if you'd like to contribute to that, and if you haven't yet, we'd be very grateful if you would tick that it's okay for that data to come to us. And so that provides just under half of the data that we get coming in a month. But what we're really trying to grow is a network of champions. So my colleague Dr. Jared Alexander, who's on the call tonight, he's responsible for the National Monitoring Plan. And he's built a network of 42 different WhatsApp groups. And I think we've got nearly 600 members across these groups, whether they're on private reserves, whether they're lodge associated, whether they timber industry associated, sugarcane, there's a whole suite of different people involved, because we realize where ground hornbills occur isn't always where birders like to go. And so the more we can increase the citizen science base away from just birders to anyone who cares about the species and is keen to drop a WhatsApp pin every time they see them. And this has just grown and grown and grown. Those are all the points on the map that have been collected in the last year and a half through our groups. We're getting a huge amount of data in. And this really helps us assess, A, what is happening with the population, what are the trends. It shows us where we need to be putting our efforts in to conserve the species, where we need to be targeting our resources. And also it shows us if any of the conservation tools that we're using are really bearing fruit. We should be able to see that in the map as we go forward. So this is a map of all of our 2020 data, and now we're into our second year. We run this monitoring cycle on a 4-year cycle because that's how you can age young ground hornbills until the age of 4. So when people send us photographs, we're able to look at the juveniles. Okay, that's a 1-year-old, that's a 2-year-old. And so we're actually also able to look at some of the smaller, finer details like group productivity, chick survival, and things through just the use of WhatsApp. Even though it's been in the middle of a pandemic, we've managed to get 67% coverage of the historic records that we had. So we're working off a base of a decade from 2009 to 2019. So even in a pandemic year, we managed to achieve that. As far as April, Jared's already been able to get resightings in those pentads within 48% of the originals. And most excitedly, we've managed to pick up 128 new pentads where these birds had never been reported before, probably because they're areas that birders aren't frequenting, hopefully because there's some areas where birds might be expanding their range. And what this is able to do is give us a minimum population estimate. And so we're looking at 400 to 600 groups, which is about 1,500 to 2,000 birds. So there's still a lot of work to do. The original historic range probably supported closer to 5,000 adults. But at least now we're able to track that. And the only way we can do that is through this wide network of champions. And, this includes school teachers, bus drivers, taxi drivers, tractor drivers, anyone who's keen and wants to help. And through this, we've been able to get a really huge amount of data in a very short time. Then the other key component are our custodians. So because ground hornbills are resident on their territories, we rely on the people who share the land with them to be their custodians. These birds don't have the luxury of being plonked in the middle of a protected area. And so the people who see them every day and share their landscape are the ones who ultimately, if they would like to have them continue, need to be the ones who become the custodians. So we've been very fortunate to win the Whitley Award this year. And with that funding, we're going to be growing this custodianship group up to 40 different groups. So that'll be 40 wild nests protected with all the ensuing education, threat mitigation, pledges and support. So we'll be able to back all of these custodians, ongoing, any questions, any training that's needed. If the local nest burns down or whatever, we can replace that before the next season. And it's through this growing network of custodians that we're going to be safeguarding the groups, one group at a time. The other major component of this is our education program. Many South Africans, because they go to the Kruger National Park and always see ground hornbills, they feel, oh, that's cool. I saw loads of ground hornbills. They're doing really well. But actually, many people don't know much about the bird. And they certainly don't know that the groups that they're seeing on a daily basis are actually really precious and part of a diminishing resource, cultural resource that we have. And so we do a lot of this outreach work. And this is Temba, which means hope in Zulu, and it's just lovely to see the interactions wherever Temba goes. When it comes to things like the window breaking, just a natural territorial response, obviously ground hornbills don't make friends. It's the fastest way to piss off your neighbors when you constantly break all of their windows. And, we work with some rural schools where the birds can easily break 400-500 window panes in a morning. And that's expensive. And a lot of our rural schools simply don't have the finances to fix that glass. So the kids end up sitting in freezing cold classrooms in winter. And that does nothing to endear them to ground hornbills. The other threat for this also is that the birds are at risk of cutting themselves. So that bottom image you can can see one of these incidences where there was a lot of blood all over the place as well. And so we've been trying to come up with ways that we can fix this. So one of the things that's working really, really well is the use of Contravision. This is a perforated vinyl film that we apply to the windows. The kids can see out because of the little holes in the vinyl. It lets the light in, because in the past, these schools would have just painted their windows to try and stop the groundhornbills breaking them, or just mixed ash with water. So this way the kids get a lot more light. The windows don't get broken because the vinyl cuts the reflection. And we've tried a number of other things. We've tried acoustic bird scarers, which only annoyed my team and did nothing for the birds. So that was an epic fail. And so we're continually trying to find new solutions. You know, this works fine for hunting camps, but all of our lodges across most of our bushveld have these huge, beautiful floor to ceiling, you know, views of the bushveld. And unfortunately, that's a lot of glass when a groundhornbill smashes it. So we're still trying to find attractive, you know, 5-star kind of solutions to this for the lodges. So then in terms of nests, this is one of our gorgeous Kruger nests in a big old dead leadwood, which gives you an idea of the kind of hollows that these birds need. And as I mentioned, they really are a limiting resource in the landscape. And over the years, wooden nests have been used very successfully, but unfortunately these nests rot after 8 to 10 years. And so we've been trying to find artificial materials to use in place of the wood that'll last more in keeping with the groundhornbill lifespan of 50, 60 years. So these are the dinosaur eggs that we're building at the moment. You can see the group on the right. That female has voted with her feet as to which of those two options she preferred. And here's a little video of one of these nests in action. That's last year's chick on the outside. Here comes one of the young helpers with a lot of food in that bundle, and the endless nagging, begging of a juvenile begging. My partner firmly believes that's the most irritating noise on the planet, and he may well be right. So another issue, obviously, is elephants taking down some of the nest trees. Not all of the nest tree species are susceptible to elephant damage. So we're just focusing on the ones that are, like female marula trees. And so we formed a partnership with Elephants Alive, where we're going to be looking at putting up beehives just in the nest trees that are vulnerable to elephant impact. This is one of the nests that we were monitoring in the Sabi Sands. It was in that ball at the bottom. It wasn't a particularly good nest, which again gives you an indication of how limiting nests are. It was super low. You could stand on the ground and look in, whereas generally groundhornbills prefer nests that are 6 meters high as a nice predator evasion technique. So this was already a substandard nest, and then an ellie came and knocked it over. Unfortunately, they had bred in the nest that year, and we did find the feathers of an almost ready to fledge chick. And then the last conservation tool that we're really focusing on is restoring the population in areas where the species has already become locally extinct. So what we do is we take the second hatch chicks, which would die naturally in the nests, like this little one in its blue basket there. And these are artificially reared, and we use these to form new groups that can go out and start restocking some of the areas where the birds have become locally extinct. So that starts with us assessing the eggs for fertility and being able to then age the embryos using these counters so that we know exactly when to go back when that second egg is due to hatch, because we don't want to visit any more than that because it's a disturbance to the nest. Here's a mama guarding her eggs and not wishing to give way, which is never fun with that dagger on the front of her face. But essentially what we do is we wait for the second chick to hatch, externally pip, like in the top right-hand corner, or be hatched already, like that tiny little sweet thing in the cup there. And the reason we do this is to make sure that the first chick, which is already 5 or 6 days old, has the best starting chance that it has. And if there's anything wrong with that first chick, we just leave the second chick because the parents will rear that as a natural insurance. So all of the energy that they put into the nest, at the end of the breeding season, they'll absolutely get something out. So we've got a number of tools that we're using, some heavily science-based, some heavily people-based, just trying to use whatever we can to slow the decline for the species. This is just a short intro into the specialized rearing facility that we built to rear these birds. This was a collaboration with the Mpumalanga Parks Board, or Mpumalanga Tourism and Parks Agency. They've leased us land, and this is the center that we built. So I'm just going to pause that there. It's called the Baobab because that's supposed to be a baobab tree in the center. When we did the early designs, it was all very lavish and tree looking, but as we started looking at our budget, it got simpler and simpler. So it's a baobab tree without any branches. But essentially on the second floor of that building, you can see the little nest hollows. So when the chicks come from the low-felt or whichever wild nest we're harvesting, they go into those artificial nests. So the people, the rearers, are on the inside of that room, and all they're doing is checking on the birds, checking temperature and feeding. But all the time they're interacting with the foster groups, which are on the outside in these aviaries that spiral out from each of these. So the chicks then fledge into these aviaries, and from there they go into a pre-release aviary where we form the new groups, and then they go out. But it's taken us a long time to figure out how to integrate that extensive learning that they need. And so what we have is a number of reintroduced groups called bush schools. So we release the young males one at a time, one per year, into these groups. And they then spend the next 3 or 4 years learning everything that they need to from their wild mentors in the group. And once they've mastered their bush skills, they themselves then become a mentor for a new group of naive youngsters. So it's a slow process. We can't figure out how to speed it up. I mean, we're always thinking of ways to speed it up. But ultimately what we need is physiologically strong birds, but they also have to be psychologically strong if they're going to survive to breeding and go on to raise their own chicks in the wild. So we're busy with 2 core areas. We're starting now from Abula through to Marakele. And in each of these cores, we need a minimum of 10 groups for it to be sustainable. And then our next area of focus is in that northern Zululand area, so we can start closing some of the gaps that formed in that map between southern Kruger and Swaziland. And so people often ask me what we think the chances are for the species, and I truly believe that there's absolute hope for the species. They're smart, they're opportunistic, they're not too fussed about habitat. You know, they do really well in overgrazed rural areas, rural grazing areas full of exotic vegetation, and there's way above average group sizes. They're breeding well. We've done health checks on those birds. We can't see anything wrong with them, and they, I think they're really adaptable and flexible, and so I'm hoping that's going to be enough to take them through into a world where we are ultimately responsible for how they end up. But I think we've designed a number of techniques. We've shown that they work. And now it really is just a case of upscaling, so we can really make a significant difference at a population scale. So I'd like to thank you all for your time this evening. And I have a huge number of supporters that we need to thank. So please do go to our website and have a look at all the numerous, very loyal, very precious supporters who keep us working. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks. Lucy, what is excluding the species from areas such as the Kalahari? The only thing that I can see in Roberts when I've gone and done a bit of reading through your presentation is that it would probably be nesting sites. So if you were to put artificial nesting sites in, you'd expand its range. Any thoughts?
So I think nesting sites, roosting sites, they big, yummy turkey-like things. Lots of things want to eat them. But then I think just too dry. So, even around Madikwe, we've even tried a couple of reintroductions there, but it's not going to see those territories don't maintain a high enough food biodiversity over time. to sustain resident groups. So in good years, when we have, a couple of really good rainfall years, we see these sort of flushes of birds moving into other areas, but they never seem to settle and be able to stick. So they'll go explore, look around, but invariably they retract. So there's a lovely paper about that down in the Eastern Cape in the Grahamstown area. And I think that's what's happening on the fringes of all of the current distribution. So we did a climatic envelope for the species, and heat is another thing for them. They're really susceptible to heat, anything over 26 degrees, and they start exhibiting heat loss behavior. And that's one of the reasons we're building the nest like we are. Is because with these heat waves, even now in Kruger, when we have these 44, 45 degree heat waves for a couple of days, we're losing embryos. And that's in really good natural nests. So we're trying to make these nests to beat the odds for the temperatures, even in 20, 30, 40 years time. So we need the nest that we're building now to outdo the best possible natural nest that is in existence at the moment.
Thanks.
There's one from the chat from Dr. Llewellyn Taylor. Jared did answer it, but he said maybe that you could elaborate, Lucy. Is there any information on courtship behavior, although they are cooperative breeders?
So the courtship behavior is a lot of bringing of gifties, and even the young males will bring gifts, but the alpha male takes good care of who's gifting who, and will keep an eye on things. And if he thinks one of the younger males is being a little too generous with roses and chocolate, he may give them a little smashing. We've seen it in our group here. We were watching this and thinking, is he really allowing this? And he obviously, that younger bird crossed some threshold, had the crap beaten out of him. He left the group for a week, and when he came back, there was a lot of sorry behavior going on. So, the alpha is always watching and keeping an eye on things, but they all do contribute, and it's a long extended thing. It's a lot of gift bringing. Basically, she's the queen. She's well looked after.
Hi, Lucy, I would like to say thank you very much. Our learners, our youth are our future. And I think through your work, you can actually save the species. And I would love to see if you can get down to Ndumu, where we can actually start and take this a little bit further, and we can see what the impact would be with these learners. There are Zulu, so I don't know whether I know you said you're going to put this animation thing in different languages, but I don't know if I missed the Zulu piece. My internet's a bit unstable tonight, but thank you. Through stories, through dramas, and I love your mascot. Your mascot will work and make a difference. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cheryl. So the animation will be in Zulu. Dr. Sina Mhlophe is going to be doing that voiceover, and then we'll be doing Songa and Venda and Swana as well. So we need to cover all language groups where the bird is, but increasingly we're working with our neighboring range states now. So we're supporting BirdLife Zimbabwe, getting their project up and running. We're going to be doing conservation planning workshops for Botswana and Namibia this year and early next year. And so the network, Jared's championship network, is already growing. It's spilling over our borders, and the amount of data that we're getting just means we can understand them better and hopefully then make better science-based decisions for them.
Hopefully a quick question, Lucy. Thank you so much for a great presentation and all the work you guys are doing. I'm in the UK, and it's just brilliant every Thursday to tune in to see what's going on around the world for a dose of hope. Lots of dots of family groups around the place. Any work to connect these guys up so that you can keep the sort of genetic diversity going and things like that?
So that's through the reintroduction program. It's too expensive and too slow to kind of mass produce groundhornbills, so we're using them strategically. So that's what we're busy doing, is trying to plug the gaps. I've got a master's student on my team, Patience Sheeter. She's starting looking at how we can also restore populations without reintroduction. So is just education combined with artificial nests going to be enough? So we're going to be using a 50-kilometer buffer along the side of Kruger National Park, and try and test what we can do there. so that, yeah, each of the current colored squares we can look to grow and support as much as we can. But I do worry for the Eastern Cape because that population is so fragmented, and we're starting to get wind farms into those areas. So one of our very few contiguous groups, I think we've got 6 or 8 groups, together, joined, linked, essentially. That's now slap bang in the middle of a proposed wind energy facility. So we're just going to have to keep at it.
So there's the map, Lucy. Marty, I guess you're unmuted. Ask your question, please.
Yes.
Perfect. So thanks. It's funny, Alistair and I were going in the same direction. He went and looked at the map, I did too. And I was just reading here where it spoke about almost seasonal migration, which I found quite interesting, because in the dark green, it shows where they are in those specific months, and then the lighter green. So is this accurate? I mean, from your talk, it sounds like it's not correct.
No, they don't migrate. What that might be is just you generally see them more during the breeding season because they're around the nest. So they're central place foragers, and they faff around the nest for about 6 months of the year, really going more than 2 k's from the nest, whereas in the dry season, they spread all out over that entire territory. So it may just be that the densities are higher in those areas and people are seeing them more. But no, they don't migrate. They're very much residential. And, we've got the ringing data and the genetic data to back that up.
Oh, perfect. Thanks.
I just want to know more. How did you start that custodian project, and how did it develop? And do you actually are they employed, or how does it work?
No, so we did 2 pilot studies. We working in areas where we knew there were nests, and we kind of had relationships with the landowners before, and so we kind of test drove the project there. So it was already using people that we knew. But the response was overwhelming, regardless of whether it was in a rural community through traditional leadership councils or through, freehold land where you're dealing with a farmer who owns his land. So, it works across both types of landscapes. But it started organically, and this is the first time we've really had a big chunk of funding to really go for it now. So we know where there are a lot more nests. Now it's just really a case of getting out there and engaging with each and every one of the communities. So we do training of all the staff. We work with the landowner. We go around the entire property and try and assess for threats. And there's some things that can't be changed. A lot of the electrocution, we're relying on Eskom to help us with that, but we do have a separate project collaboration with BirdLife and Eskom on that, testing some of the cheaper devices to try and just put on transformer boxes. So yeah, I guess it's all kind of interconnected, Tam. It's the education, it's the citizen science, it's all kind of meshed. Provision of nests. They in turn then do the monitoring, which saves us a lot of time and resources. But it also really makes people want to be involved. They start seeing them as their birds. This is my family group. And especially, when we deal with a lot of the elders in communities, if Groundhornbills live that long, the alpha male in that group was probably a chick, when the elder was a small boy. And, once you can start making those links of actually how similar they are to us, then people they fall in love with them, and suddenly they look at them with new eyes.
First question from Rhonda Coverse. Can you discuss the situation with young female hornbills? Why are they excluded from the group at a young age, territorial, and how do they get on without the group afterwards?
So we don't really understand why. We do know that the aggression comes from the alpha male rather than the alpha female, which is what we would have expected. And that aggression can be quite violent. And we've actually lost some birds in the captive situation because we didn't pick up the signs fast enough. And those young females were actually killed. So they really quite violently escorted out of the group. But what they do is they fly pretty much under the radar. So they're still within that network of different territories, but they don't call. Their behavior is very sneaky. If they get lonely, they'll either band up with other young females, and even if they're doing the dawn chorus, they will do both the male and female parts of the duet. If they're on their own, they band up with troops of baboons, herds of impala. Groundhornbills are just so social. They hate being on their own. And so I guess all those extra eyes helps them survive. And then, they basically just live under the radar until in the morning when they're all doing that calling, they suddenly hear, oh, Mrs. So-and-so is not there. Nice. And they will duck in. And we've often seen these changeovers happen within 24 hours in a system like Kruger, where it's back-to-back groups. You know, there's obviously a lot of dispersals moving around within that kind of system. So the takeover can be almost instant when an alpha female is lost.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And then a second question from Dr. Taylor. Sorry, Lucy, does the courtship behavior differ between the southern and northern species where they are sympatric, Sorry.
We have no idea is the short answer. Next to nothing is known about the northerns. We're not even sure that they're cooperative breeders or not cooperative breeders. You know, that's the level of don't know for the northerns. So I'm in the process. We've started up a Northern Groundhornbill working group. I've got a PhD student in Ghana who's really just starting the basic biology now. So yeah, we don't know. Haven't got a clue. Don't even want to guess.
In the sort of cultural side, I think it's Eswatini, which was the old Swaziland. It's quite a prominent thing for the chiefs to actually display ground hornbill feathers in their headdress, or am I wrong in that? But also to what extent is there that sort of superstition about ground hornbills and the threat?
So in Eswatini, it's I think that it's the bird's called Lagwala Gwala. I can't remember which bird it is because I only remember the Swazi name. So it's not ground hornbills. In Mozambique, we have seen ground hornbill feathers in some of the dance headgear. The biggest thing that ground hornbills are known for is being associated with the first really good rains of the season. So ground hornbills, because they spend so much time around the nest, and the other thing that we've learned with time is ground hornbills call every morning. That's just how they're maintaining their territories, because 100 square k's you don't want to do on foot, you'll run out of energy, so you use your voice. But in the run up to the female laying her eggs, they call more frequently throughout the day. And so people become that much more aware of them. And they only really breed if it's going to be a good year. They couldn't be bothered to breed if the rains aren't good. And so people have associated good rains, the predicting, of good rains. And if you're a rural farmer, good rains is what you need to know A, when to plant your crops, and also B, to secure a really good season, because without your crops, you're going to have a really horrible year. And so over millennia with subsistence farmers, that has come into being. So a lot of the association is about rain, about lightning. You can put a feather in your roof to stop lightning striking your house. And then I think also they're quite frightening birds. I think there's also an element of fear. It's a big what's the word? All the warning colors, black, red, and white, giant dagger of a face. So I think they're quite scary, and I think there's also an element of fear. And so if they come near your homes, people are likely to chase them away, which is also great because then they're less likely to break your windows. So there is a little bit of use for ritual and for medicine, but it's really nothing like vultures or pangolins. It's opportunistic. Maybe guys out hunting with their dogs might catch a youngster. But there's no targeted trade, and we do work with the Traditional Healer Council on that. So we're busy setting up networks on how to sustain the importance, because without that importance, we would literally probably just have ground hornbills left in Kruger and nowhere else. So what we want to do is support these belief systems, and in areas where they've become eroded, try and ignite those feelings of love, about this iconic species.